You probably don't think much about bread before you sleep. But in 944 CE, a loaf of rye bread could put you in a waking nightmare, or worse, end your life. This wasn't some slow, creeping malnutrition or accidental choking. No, this was ergotism, known in its day as holy fire, a poisoning so violent, so terrifying, that entire communities vanished from its effects. We begin in the French village of Pont-Saint-Esprit, though better remembered for its bizarre mid-20th century hallucination episode. The town shares its name and symptoms with a much older affliction. To understand it, we must go back to the Middle Ages, when bread was the axis of daily survival, and the line between nourishment and poison was perilously thin. In medieval Europe, bread wasn't a side dish. It was life itself. For the peasantry, bread made up to 80% of caloric intake. Peasants rarely consumed meat. Cheese was a luxury, and fruits or vegetables were seasonal. The only consistent fuel? Bread. But not the airy, fluffy loaf you might imagine. No white flour. No sourdough starter with a cute name. Medieval bread was dense, coarse, dark, made from rye, barley, or even acorns in years of scarcity. And in those lean years, desperate villagers were forced to bake bread from moldy or poorly stored grain. Rye, particularly, was a double-edged sword. It grew well in cold, damp climates where wheat failed. But it also carried a dangerous secret. Claviceps purpurea, a fungus that infected the grain, turning it into something deadly. To the untrained eye, ergot looked like a slightly misshapen kernel. To the untrained stomach, it spelled doom. Ergotism manifests in two horrifying ways. Convulsive ergotism, hallucinations, convulsions, crawling sensations under the skin, and psychotic episodes. You might think you've been cursed by a demon. Gangrenous ergotism, the narrowing of blood vessels, leading to burning pain, blackened limbs, and ultimately the spontaneous loss of fingers, toes, or entire arms and legs. This burning sensation gave rise to the name St. Anthony's fire. People would often travel to shrines dedicated to St. Anthony in search of healing, and these sites became some of the earliest hospitals in Europe. In a world without understanding of bacteria or fungi, ergotism was considered divine punishment or diabolical affliction. People believed the devil had taken over their bodies, or that they were being purified by fire. Rarely did they blame the bread. Yet bread it was, the very thing meant to nourish, betrayingly toxic. One of the most catastrophic outbreaks occurred in 944 AD, where 40,000 people reportedly died in France from ergot poisoning. But this wasn't a one-time event. Cases would rise and fall for centuries across Europe. The symptoms confused physicians and terrified communities. In some regions, those affected were thought to be possessed. In others, they were accused of witchcraft. The stigma deepened suffering. Many were abandoned to die, believing they were cursed or contagious. The 17th century saw particularly brutal outbreaks, especially in Eastern Europe. Some scholars argue that ergot poisoning may have even played a role in the Salem witch trials in 1692. The convulsions, hallucinations, and erratic behavior of the accusers bear a striking resemblance to the symptoms of convulsive ergotism. Could it be that the bread, not the devil, was to blame? What's striking is that medieval people kept eating the bread, even after seeing its effects. Why? Because they had no choice. In times of famine or war, food stores would be hoarded or spoiled. Moldy grain was still food. If your children were starving, would you throw away the only flour you had, even if it might harm them? The survival paradox shaped much of medieval life. People developed subtle techniques without understanding their science. Soaking grain, discarding oddly colored kernels, or feeding the worst flour to animals. But these precautions were inconsistent at best. Many believed the fire came from sin, not spores. And so, year after year, the poison returned. Unlike plague or war, ergotism never made front-page history. It crept through villages silently. It burned bodies slowly. It left no memorials or epic poems. But it shaped the medical, agricultural, and even spiritual practices of an entire continent. By the 19th century, with the rise of industrial milling and more consistent food storage, outbreaks became rarer, but they never entirely disappeared. Even in the 20th century, small communities faced outbreaks due to contaminated flour. In 1951, the town of Pont-Saint-Esprit experienced a mass poisoning event initially blamed on ergot, though later theories suggested LSD-like chemicals or government experiments. The fact remains, a loaf of bread turned into a vehicle of madness. What else, we might wonder, hides behind the ordinary? When we left off, we were standing in the darkened bread ovens of medieval Europe, where a moldy sack of rye could mean the difference between life and a screaming, hallucinatory death. But as the poison claimed lives in silence, an unexpected figure began to emerge amid the chaos. St. Anthony, a man long dead, now revered as a beacon of hope for those scorched by holy fire. This section explores the institutions that emerged from ergotism, the silent ways people coped, and how the unknowable suffering of thousands helped shape the earliest versions of hospitals, medical orders, and organized caregiving in Europe. The cure, it turned out, was not only chemical, but spiritual, communal, and architectural. St. Anthony of Egypt died in the 4th century, but his name became immortal among the 6 centuries later, thanks to the Order of St. Anthony, a religious brotherhood formed in the 11th century in response to a major outbreak of gangrenous ergotism in France. These monks were not just priests, they were caretakers. Known for their hospitality, their healing methods were based on a mix of herbal medicine, religious rituals, and, most crucially, a special diet that replaced contaminated rye with pure wheat bread and wine. Miraculously, patients often recovered. Today, we know why. They had removed the ergot from their diets. The order's emblem, the Tau cross, T-shaped, and the blue-robed pig, became a symbol of healing and comfort throughout France, Germany, and Italy. Monasteries soon became sanctuaries for the ergot-afflicted, offering not just food and treatment, but hope. These institutions are now seen as precursors to the modern hospital. But what does it say about the state of medical knowledge that monks with better kitchens could outperform doctors? The term Ignis Acer, holy fire, did not begin as a medical label, but as a theological one. The burning limbs of the afflicted, their uncontrollable spasms, and their descent into madness were viewed as trials from God. Patients often described ants crawling under their skin, or claimed that demons were gnawing at their bones. To medieval minds steeped in Christian cosmology, this was not infection. It was possession or punishment. That's why many of the afflicted were tied down, doused in holy water, or made to confess imagined sins. Some were even exorcised. And yet, even through such ignorance, a strange pattern emerged. The closer people moved to monastic life, to clean food, clean water, and a consistent environment, the better they fared. Inadvertently, the monks had found a cure. As understanding of ergot remained primitive, bakers found themselves at the crossroads of survival and suspicion. In small villages, when outbreaks occurred, people began looking for someone to blame, and the baker was the obvious choice. Some were accused of poisoning on purpose. Others were run out of town, beaten, or worse. Yet bakers were often victims themselves. They didn't know the mold was dangerous. They simply milled what was available. Some began employing low-tech tests, like soaking grains in water to spot the floating, lighter ergot bodies. Others turned to roasting grain, which helped slightly. Still, without microscopes or germ theory, these precautions were inconsistent. So while people looked to saints and monks, the real front line was in the flour mill, the bakehouse, and the dark corners of rural pantries. In regions where convulsive ergotism was more common, something stranger unfolded. Reports of mass hysteria, visions, and spiritual awakenings. Some historians argue that these episodes helped fuel medieval mysticism and flagellant movements, groups who believed that suffering, whipping, and public penance would bring divine favor. There are even reports from the 13th and 14th centuries of entire convents erupting into fits of screaming and convulsions. While often attributed to hysteria or demonic possession, modern scholars have re-examined these events in light of what we now know about ergot. Is it possible that entire religious movements were born from fungus-laced food? Some accounts describe vivid hallucinations, talking animals, celestial visions, apocalyptic warnings, and violent outbursts. To the medieval mind, these were revelations. But to us, they suggest a community-wide intoxication. What makes ergotism particularly chilling is how easily it could have been prevented, if only people had known what to look for. But in an era of low literacy, poor nutrition, and no science, danger lurked in what should have been safe. Some folk traditions began to evolve, driven by painful experience rather than understanding. Throw out the purple grain became a rural saying. In parts of Germany, mothers were taught to smell the flower. Ergot has a slightly sweet, earthy odor. In Slavic regions, herbal lore developed around purifying flour with teas and vinegars. None of these methods were perfect, but they represented the beginnings of applied survival knowledge, fragile threads of wisdom passed orally between generations. And yet, ergotism persisted. For all its devastating symptoms, it remained largely ignored by scholars and elites. Why? Because it mostly affected peasants. The nobility ate white wheat. The poor ate rye. Disease, it seems, also followed class lines. As grain trade grew and markets expanded, the contamination traveled with it. In some towns, bans were placed on foreign rye. In others, grain inspectors were appointed. Early food safety workers whose job was to sniff, inspect, and sometimes even taste flour before it was sold. Over time, urban centers became safer, but rural areas, especially in Eastern Europe, continued to suffer sporadic outbreaks well into the 1800s. In some records, a mysterious wasting illness is noted unnamed, unexplained, but very likely ergotism. Its victims disappeared quietly, buried with little ceremony, remembered only by local rumor. Which brings us to a final, sobering realization. How many of the unnamed illnesses, the mysterious madnesses, and the quiet deaths of history were caused by a loaf of bread? By now, you followed the silent killer from medieval ovens to the shrines of saints, through the panic of convulsing villages, and into the whispered rumors of bread that could burn you from the inside. But the story of ergot doesn't end in the Middle Ages. What was once seen as a curse from God eventually became a scientific curiosity, and then, astonishingly, a foundation for modern medicine. In this final section, we uncover how ergot shifted from a cause of suffering to a cure, how it played an eerie role in the creation of LSD, and how its effects, terrifying and beautiful, still echo in the world today. The decline of ergotism was not the result of any single invention. Rather, it faded gradually, like smoke from a long-burning fire. As European societies moved toward urbanization, regulation, and better grain storage, the conditions that favored Claviceps purpurea began to disappear. By the 19th century, outbreaks had become rare in Western Europe, though rural eastern regions still suffered. With the Industrial Revolution came more controlled agriculture, wider access to wheat, and crucially, the rise of food science. But even before ergot fully disappeared, curious minds had begun asking dangerous questions. Could this fungus, so harmful in bulk, have useful properties in small doses? The answer was yes, and it would change the course of medicine and consciousness forever. As early as the 1500s, midwives in Europe had noticed something peculiar. Very small amount of ergot preparations, when carefully administered, could stimulate uterine contractions and help expel the placenta after childbirth. It was risky, yes, but sometimes effective. By the 18th and 19th centuries, this practice became formalized, and ergot derivatives were used, often with unpredictable results, in obstetric medicine. This made ergot one of the first known examples of a toxic substance repurposed for healing. Doctors began experimenting with ergotamine, a compound extracted from the fungus, which was later found to be useful in treating severe migraines by constricting blood vessels, postpartum hemorrhage, even certain heart conditions. In time, this accidental medicine from a medieval curse was manufactured, standardized, and sold as ergometrine, a powerful tool in 20th century medicine. Yet, the most famous and controversial legacy of ergot was still to come. In 1938, a Swiss chemist named Albert Hofmann was working at the pharmaceutical company Sandoz Laboratories. He was studying alkaloids derived from ergot, hoping to synthesize a respiratory stimulant. Instead, he created something entirely unexpected, lysergic acid diethylamide, or LSD-25. At first, it seemed useless, but 5 years later, Hofmann accidentally absorbed a small amount through his fingertips, and history changed. He wrote, "I was affected by a remarkable restlessness, combined with a slight dizziness. At home, I lay down and sank into a not unpleasant intoxicated-like condition. The outer world seemed changed as in a dream. Hoffman had discovered the most potent hallucinogen known to science, derived from the same fungus that once blackened limbs and filled monasteries with the screams of the afflicted. LSD would go on to become a cornerstone of psychiatric research, a symbol of 1960s counterculture, and a topic of moral, scientific, and political debate. It was used in experiments on consciousness, creativity, therapy, and even military mind control programs. And it all began with bread. Beyond LSD and obstetrics, ergot continues to have a shadowy presence in medicine. Some derivatives are still used today, under strict conditions, for controlling postpartum bleeding, managing certain hormonal disorders, treating Parkinson's disease, and migraines. Yet its toxicity remains. Misuse of ergot alkaloids can still cause vasospasm, hallucinations, and gangrene, eerily similar to the medieval symptoms we've already met. Modern pharmaceuticals must be carefully controlled, purified, and dosed. The same compound that once made people dance in the streets in burning agony now sits, measured and labeled, on hospital shelves. What a journey for a fungus. Ergotism rarely made history books. Its victims were too poor, too rural, too invisible. Yet across the centuries, it shaped untold thousands of lives. It inspired the first patient-centered religious orders. It influenced religious fervor, witch trials, and possibly mass psychogenic episodes. It helped birth modern obstetrics and psychiatry. It blurred the line between medicine and madness. And today, it whispers through our culture still. Every time someone talks about psychedelics, about altered states, about mystical experiences, it raises a quiet, unsettling question. How much of what we call spiritual, visionary, or even revolutionary was, at some point, just a fungus in a grain? As you drift into sleep, imagine the thousands of loaves of bread, lovingly kneaded by callous hands, baked in soot-dark ovens, sliced with dull knives, and eaten in flickering candlelight. Among them, hidden and silent, were the seeds of sickness and the roots of medicine. The ergot fungus, invisible to the eye, shaped saints and sinners, midwives and madmen, monks and mystics. It was not a grand war or a sweeping empire. It was just a moldy loaf of bread. But sometimes, history hides its loudest stories in the quietest places. You likely know Victorian London for its fog, gas lamps, and horse-drawn carriages. Perhaps the world of Charles Dickens or Sherlock Holmes comes to mind. But behind that romantic image lay a truth far more pungent and infinitely more important to the daily survival of its residents. Before indoor plumbing became the standard, London was drowning in its own excrement. The city, growing rapidly during the 19th century, was generating more human waste than it could hide, let alone process. And into this problem stepped a peculiar, forgotten figure of urban survival, the night soil man. They were the unsung laborers who crept through cities after dark, emptying cesspits, hauling away the waste of thousands, and carrying out to the edges of society. These men were not just sanitation workers. They were guardians of public health, brokers of the bizarre economy, and the final defense between civilization and collapse. This is their story. Modern sanitation is a marvel, so omnipresent we hardly notice it. Toilets flush, water disappears. But in early 19th century London, this system didn't exist. To relieve yourself, you'd either use a chamber pot and empty it in the gutter, share an outhouse in the back alley, or live in a wealthier household with access to a cesspit, an underground tank, to collect human waste over time. These cesspits would fill slowly, becoming not only foul-smelling but dangerous. They could leak into basements, contaminate groundwater, and collapse unexpectedly. At some point, they had to be emptied by hand. Enter the night soil men. The term night soil was a polite euphemism for human waste, and the night soil men were professionals hired to remove it, typically working between midnight and dawn to avoid detection, judgment, or interruption. They carried buckets or barrels, made of wood and sealed with tar, lanterns for navigating the dark alleys, shovels and hooks, to reach down into cesspits and scoop out the thick mass below. They worked in small teams, often climbing into the cesspits themselves, a choking, toxic environment filled with methane, ammonia, and worse. They would shovel the waste into barrels, seal them, and transport them outside the city, sometimes on horse-drawn wagons, other times by handcart. It was grueling work. It was filthy, but it was also essential. Victorian London smelled of many things, but human waste was chief among them. Streets were littered with horse manure, an estimated 1,000 tons per day in the 1800s, rotting food and animal carcasses from open-air markets, and of course, human waste from chamber pots tossed into gutters, an act often preceded by the warning cry. Gardaloo, even the famed River Thames, source of London's drinking water, was little more than an open sewer. By the 1840s, it had become so foul that newspapers called it a living mass of corruption. The night soil men were not simply a convenience. They were all that stood between London and collapse by contagion. The hazards faced by night soil men were numerous. Asphyxiation. Cesspits often contained lethal concentrations of gases. Disease, cholera, typhoid, dysentery, all spread through contaminated water and poor hygiene. Explosions. Methane buildup occasionally caused cesspit explosions, especially when disturbed too quickly. Accidents, collapsing floors, drowning in pits, or falls from ladders were common. Despite the risks, night soil men were relatively well paid compared to other laborers, earning wages up to twice that of a factory worker. But they were socially shunned, often relegated to living on the fringes of town. Children would run from them. Women crossed the street to avoid them. And yet, everyone needed them. Incredibly, human waste had value. It was used as fertilizer in nearby agricultural areas. Wealthy estates would buy London muck to enrich their gardens. A full wagon of night soil might sell for a decent profit, once hauled outside city limits. This created a bizarre economic incentive. Human waste became a commodity. Some night soil men formed cooperatives, charging homeowners for removal, then selling the waste to farmers. Others contracted with the city to service entire neighborhoods. London's economy, in a quiet, pungent way, was powered by its own bowels. But this system was fragile. It depended on manpower, moonlight, and luck. And when the population exploded during the Industrial Revolution, the cracks began to show. The tipping point came with a series of cholera outbreaks, beginning in 1831 and continuing into the 1850s. Tens of thousands died. The connection between water, waste, and disease remained poorly understood until Dr. John Snow famously traced an 1854 cholera outbreak to a single water pump in Soho. This, combined with the infamous Great Stink of 1858, forced Parliament to act. The stench of the Thames had grown so unbearable that lawmakers had to soak their curtains in chloride of lime just to meet. Out of this olfactory crisis came a radical change. London's modern sewer system, designed by Joseph Bazalgette, began construction in the 1860s. It would reroute waste beneath the city and far downstream, away from drinking water and densely populated areas. It marked the beginning of the end for the night soil men. As indoor plumbing spread and Bazalgette's sewers expanded, the need for manual cesspit emptying dwindled. By the late 19th century, night soil men became rare in central London, though they persisted in poor or rural areas well into the early 20th century. Some adapted, becoming sewer inspectors or sanitation workers. Others disappeared into history, their legacy lost beneath cleaner streets and flush toilets. Today, their contributions are almost forgotten. There are few monuments to them, few records, no romanticized paintings. But they built modern cities with their backs, their buckets, and their tolerance for things the rest of society could not bear to see or smell. And so, one is left to wonder, would Victorian London have survived without its most invisible workers? Or did civilization only rise because someone, somewhere, was willing to shovel its waste? By the 1850s, Victorian London had become a global capital of empire, wealth, and industry. Steamships chugged down the Thames. The British flag flew over distant colonies, and railways stitched the countryside together. Yet beneath this power and progress lurked a stench so powerful, so unbearable, that it finally brought one of the world's greatest cities to its knees. This was the Great Stink, a hot summer in 1858, when the Thames became a giant open sewer, and the smell of human waste grew so intense that Parliament nearly evacuated. In this section, we dive into how a crisis of odor and infrastructure forced Victorian elites to act, how waste shaped public health policy, and how the stinking river led to one of the most ambitious engineering projects in British history. By mid-century, London's population had exploded, from around 1 million in 1800 to over 3 million by 1860. This massive influx of people overwhelmed the already precarious waste systems. Despite the work of the night soil men, most homes still relied on cesspits, privies, or chamber pots, and many were now connected to a new invention, the flush toilet. These seemed like an improvement, but without a modern sewer system, all that flush waste went directly into the Thames, along with animal carcasses, industrial runoff, and general refuse. The result? A river that bubbled with filth. In the summer of 1858, temperatures soared, and with them rose the stench of decay. The Thames, sluggish and thick with waste, became unbearable. People living along the bank stuffed curtains into window cracks, soaked clothes in vinegar, and carried handkerchiefs doused in perfume just to survive the daily walk to work. Newspapers called it pestilential. One described the water as a brown, opaque fluid, the true London water, a liquid dung. Even members of Parliament, whose chamber sat beside the river, found the stench unmanageable. Curtains were soaked in chloride of lime, a harsh disinfectant, but even this couldn't mask the smell. Some members suggested relocating government operations upriver. It was no longer just a poor person's problem. The elite could now smell their own neglect. Prior to this crisis, many officials still believed in miasma theory, the idea that disease spread through bad air rather than contaminated water. But as cholera returned again and again, and as Dr. John Snow's findings gained traction, a new urgency took hold. The great stink forced politicians to act, not out of compassion, but from personal disgust. This may be one of the only times in history where a smell drove legislative change. Within weeks, Parliament approved funding for a massive sewer overhaul, designed by civil engineer Joseph Bazalgette. Bazalgette, then chief engineer of the Metropolitan Board of Works, had already drawn up plans for a modern sewer system, but had been denied funding for years. Now, with the great stink in every nostril, the money finally flowed. His plan was ambitious. Over 1,300 miles of street sewers, 82 miles of intercepting sewers, giant pumping stations and embankments, all leading waste downriver, well past the populated parts of London. Construction began swiftly in 1859. Using brick tunnels, massive labor forces, and a combination of gravity and steam power, Bazalgette began to reshape the city from underneath. In effect, he was doing what the night soil men had done by hand, on a geologic scale. With the spread of the sewer system, cesspits were gradually abolished. New laws required buildings to connect to the new mains. Privies were replaced by water closets. Manual collection of waste declined, but the process was uneven. In poor neighborhoods, old habits persisted for decades. Slums in areas like Whitechapel and Southwark continued to rely on chamber pots and shared outhouses. Night soil men still plied their trade, but their ranks were thinning. By the end of the 19th century, they had all but disappeared from central London, living on only in memory and in the countryside, where plumbing remained a luxury. Bazalgette's work transformed London. Not only did it improve public health, but it also reduced cholera deaths, though not immediately, since miasma theory still influenced water sources. Created new embankments, including the Victoria and Albert embankments, which gave the city more walkable riverfronts. Inspired similar projects in cities around the world, from Paris to New York. Yet, for all its brilliance, this transformation came decades late, delayed by denial, political inertia, and class blindness. Countless people died of preventable diseases in the time it took London's elite to care, and those who had kept the system running, the night soil men, the scavengers, the river workers, were mostly forgotten in the official histories. They had bought the city time with their labor and their lungs. Bazalgette had simply made their work obsolete. The Great Stink is often remembered today with bemused attachment, a quirky historical anecdote, but it was a watershed moment. It forced a reckoning between modernity and mortality. For once, progress could no longer be postponed. The stink, then, was more than just foul. It was transformative. It marked the moment when infrastructure became survival, and when invisible labor sanitation finally earned its due. And perhaps, most ironically of all, the flush toilet, that great invention of convenience, had made the problem worse before making it better. So, next time you pull a handle and watch everything vanish in a swirl of water, consider this. Would our cities be as clean, as livable, or as survivable, if not for the great stink? And who were the workers who bore the smell before the pipes did? While the night soil men removed the waste, another group made their living from what was left behind. They were scavengers, mudlarks, toshers, and sewer hunters, the lowest of the low, yet part of a complex and informal economy that flourished on the banks and bowels of the city. They combed through filth, mud, and decay not to clean it, but to extract value. A button here, a coin there, a scrap of copper or bone. This final section explores the strange professions that grew out of London's waste crisis, how entire families survived on refuse, how danger and disease were part of daily work, and how the invisible architecture of survival shaped the great city above. The term mudlark originally referred to children and women who scavenged the shores of the River Thames at low tide. They waded through mud, sludge, and sewage, hoping to find coal lumps washed from ships, bits of iron, rope, nails, or copper, lost jewelry or coins, bones or rags to sell for glue and papermaking. Mudlarking required timing, instinct, and grit. The best pickings came just as the tide began to fall. But the risks were immense. Tidal surges could trap the unwary. The mud itself could swallow boots or bodies whole. Sharp objects and disease were constant threats. Most mudlarks were children aged 8 to 12, many orphans, or from destitute families. They sold their finds to rag and bone men, or scrap dealers for a few pennies. Barely enough to eat. They lived on the margins. But in a city where thousands starved, waste became livelihood. Toshers were a different breed. These were typically adult men who entered the sewers themselves, often illegally, to search for valuables lost through drains. Jewelry, cutlery, copper pipes, coins dropped down sinks or privies. They worked in teams, navigating the dangerous, dark tunnels with long poles with hooks to fish for debris, lanterns, carefully shielded due to methane risk, oilskins or rags wrapped around their legs to fend off rats and chemicals. Toshers often memorized the maps of London's underground, crawling through tight spaces that even the sanitation workers avoided. They faced toxic gas, particularly hydrogen sulfide and methane, sewer surges from rainfall or redirected waste, rat bites, sometimes leading to deadly infections. And yet, successful toshers could make a decent living, sometimes more than a labor or factory hand. A single gold ring or silver fork could feed a family for a week, but they worked without protection, without contracts, and without rights. If one died in the tunnel, he simply didn't return. Not all scavenging was illegal. Some sewer hunters were licensed contractors, hired by the city to remove blockages or collect useful debris. But many blurred the line, using their jobs as a cover for personal treasure hunts. There was a thriving market for tosh, the slang term for scrap metal. Traders rarely asked questions about origin. Even human bones, particularly long bones and skulls, could be sold to medical schools or novelty shops. Some families operated entire scavenging economies. Fathers hunted the sewers. Mothers sorted and cleaned. Children picked through the Thames. It was dirty work, but it was work. And in Victorian London, that was enough. Despite their usefulness, mudlarks and toshers were socially reviled. They were seen as dirty, criminal, or insane. Newspapers often mocked them, painting them as grotesque or primitive. No one erected statues for men who crawled through sewers. No one interviewed the children who found warmth in manure piles near the docks. And yet, these scavengers prevented blockages by removing debris, recovered lost property worth thousands of pounds, fed entire neighborhoods through the dark alchemy of refuse. And still, they died young. Disease, injury, drowning, or simple exhaustion claimed most by their 30s. Their lives, like the waste they scavenge, were disposed of without ceremony. It is easy to think of sanitation as something separate from progress, an invisible background. But the mudlarks and tashers remind us that every great city rests on the shoulders of those who handle what others refuse to touch. They also challenge our sense of value. What one person flushes, another may treasure. What one person buries in a cesspit, another might sell for supper. Even today, cities have their scavengers, sorting through landfill, reclaiming copper wire, salvaging building waste. The profession may change, but the function does not. These are the people who ensure the system works, even when no one wants to acknowledge them. By the end of the 19th century, with the sewer system expanded and waste treatment more advanced, the tashers and mudlarks faded from view. Licensing laws increased police surveillance, and improved sanitation made scavenging less viable. But they never disappeared entirely. Today, mudlarking has become a legal hobby, regulated by permit. Hobbyists scour the Thames for history, finding Roman coins, medieval pins, and Tudor shoes. What was once a job of desperation is now a pastime of curiosity. But the river remembers, and in its murky depths lie the fingerprints of those who once survived by searching what others discarded. As you drift into rest, think not of palaces or cathedrals, but of the hidden economy that sustained them. Think of the child ankle-deep in mud, squinting for glints of metal. Think of the man, half-crouched in a sewer tunnel, hoping the next object in his hand isn't a rat. History is not always made by kings. Sometimes it is carried out on the backs of those who crawl, who shovel, who sift, and who quietly keep the city from devouring itself. Today, we associate bathing with hygiene, self-care, and good health. A warm bath calms the nerves. A hot shower starts the day. But rewind the clock to medieval and early modern Europe, and you find that bathing, especially in water, was often seen as suspicious, indulgent, or even deadly. In fact, for centuries, many people believed that bathing could make you more likely to catch disease. Doctors warned against it. Parents discouraged it. Public bathhouses were slowly shuttered, and by the time of the 17th century plague outbreaks, some of Europe's finest citizens went months or even years without washing their bodies in water. This is a story of how soap fell out of favor, why water became dangerous, and how our modern sense of hygiene was, for a long time, considered foolish at best and deadly at worst. Imagine walking through a medieval city street. Not the tourist reconstructed kind, but the real thing. Narrow alleys, overflowing gutters, and houses packed tight. The smell was intense. Sweat, manure, tanneries, smoke, rotting vegetables, chamber pots emptied from upstairs windows. People didn't bathe often, and when they did, it was usually with cold water, shared water, or not water at all. Dry rubbing with cloths, scented powders, or simple scraping tools were more common than actual washing. And yet, in the early Middle Ages, bathhouses still thrived. During the Roman Empire and into the early medieval period, public bathhouses were common in many European towns. Communal, gender-separated or sometimes not, and heated by furnaces or firewood. These spaces provided hot water, steam, and a place to socialize. They were centers of community life. In cities like Paris, London, Cologne, and Florence, bathhouses remained active well into the 13th and 14th centuries. Wealthier households sometimes had private baths, though heating water was labor-intensive. Soap, while expensive, was made from animal fat and ash, and sometimes scented with herbs or oils. Bathing was seen as both pleasurable and virtuous, a way to cleanse body and soul. So what changed? The turning point came not from water itself, but from fear. As plague swept through Europe in the 14th century, most infamously the Black Death of 1347 to 1351, doctors and common people alike began searching for causes and scapegoats. With no germ theory, no microscopes, and no antibiotics, explanations were drawn from humoral medicine, astrology, and superstition. One theory took hold and stuck for centuries, that bathing opened pores, and through those open pores bad air, miasma, could enter the body. To bathe, then, was to expose yourself to infection. Physicians warned that warm water softened the skin, making it easier for plague or corrupted vapors to enter. Bathing was no longer cleansing. It was dangerous. As public bathhouses declined due to disease fears, another concern emerged: morality. Religious leaders began decrying the nudity and mixed-gender use of bathhouses. The Catholic Church increasingly condemned bathing as sinful, indulgent, or lewd. Some bathhouses became associated with brothels, particularly in German-speaking regions where the word Badstuhl began to carry a double meaning. By the 1500s, public baths were closing across Europe. Cities issued bans. Priests preached sermons. Even kings and nobles began retreating from the tub. The irony? Bathhouses likely reduced disease transmission through cleaner skin and clothing. But once the fear took hold, logic drowned in rumor. One of the most cited examples of this hygiene reversal is King Louis XIV of France. He is rumored to have bathed only twice in his life, and instead masked his odor with heavy perfumes. While that particular claim is likely exaggerated, it reflects a real cultural shift. By the 17th and 18th centuries, dry cleaning the body was considered safer and more refined than bathing. Instead of water, people used dry cloths or brushes to remove dirt, perfumed gloves to cleanse the hands and face, linen undergarments, changed frequently to absorb sweat and be laundered. The idea was that clean linens made for a clean person, even if the skin beneath remained untouched for months. Cleanliness also became a marker of class and virtue. The aristocracy, with access to perfumes, powders, and fine fabrics, could maintain the appearance of hygiene without water. Meanwhile, peasants and laborers, who might wash in rivers or public wells, were viewed as unclean by nature, no matter how often they bathed. The irony deepens. Those who washed with water were seen as lower class. Those who avoided it were civilized. This inversion of hygiene would persist for centuries, and in some ways continues in our culture: deodorants, dry shampoos, and scented products. We may be clean, but we still often mask rather than cleanse. Long after plague had faded, the fear of bathing remained. In the 18th century, European doctors still warned against full-body immersion, especially during pregnancy or illness. Some even advised washing only a single limb at a time to avoid shocking the system. Hospitals were built without bathrooms, and medical staff often discouraged patients from bathing during recovery. Soldiers, too, were told to avoid water. Muddy boots were fine, but clean skin was risky. The result? Generations of people who feared the very act we now associate with health, relaxation, and renewal. Soap, too, came under suspicion. In some places, it was taxed as a luxury good. In others, it was believed to strip protective oils from the skin, leaving the body vulnerable. Soap makers were sometimes ostracized for working with lye, tallow, and animal bones, products associated with death and uncleanliness. It wasn't until the 19th century, thanks to germ theory, industrial production, and public health reform, that soap regained its place in society. But for much of history, it was not a daily item. It was dangerous, decadent, or demonic. So, we're left with a question as puzzling as it is unsettling. How did cleanliness become dangerous, and why did it take so long to realize the truth? By the end of the 18th century, Europe stood at the threshold of modernity. Empires stretched across continents. Science and industry began reshaping society. But despite revolutions in politics and technology, the average European still clung to a belief that had haunted generations: that bathing was dangerous. This section explores the slow and uneasy return of water to the body. We'll examine the scientific discoveries, military reforms, and imperial politics that forced society to reevaluate the hygiene it had long avoided. And we'll see how one simple substance, soap, transformed from a suspicious luxury into a cornerstone of public health. The first real blow to centuries of superstition came not from soap or baths, but from a microscope. In the mid-19th century, scientists like Louis Pasteur and Robert Koch began developing germ theory, the idea that diseases were not caused by bad air or miasmas, but by microscopic organisms transmitted through touch, breath, water, and waste. This was a revolutionary idea. Suddenly, unwashed hands, dirty clothes, and stagnant water weren't just unpleasant, they were lethal. Pasteur's discoveries in fermentation and bacteria, along with Koch's work on cholera and tuberculosis, laid the foundation for modern microbiology, and crucially, they showed that disease could be prevented, not just endured. Still, It would take decades before the public fully accepted this invisible enemy. Beliefs die hard, especially when they're comfortable. While scientists peered through lenses, war brought hygiene to the battlefield. During the Crimean War, 1853 to 1856, British soldiers were dying in shocking numbers, not from wounds, but from infectious diseases spread in unsanitary hospitals. Enter Florence Nightingale, a nurse and reformer who believed that cleanliness saved lives. At the British-based hospital in Scutari, Nightingale demanded regular bathing of patients, clean bedding and air circulation, hand washing between procedures, basic sanitary infrastructure. Mortality rates plummeted, though she still worked under the older miasma model. Her insistence on cleanliness as a virtue and a tool of survival helped reshape military medicine. Her data-driven approach also influenced hospital reform back home. In essence, war forced a reevaluation of hygiene, not out of comfort, but out of necessity. As cities grew during the Industrial Revolution, so did the working class. Tenements housed hundreds, often without plumbing, and disease spread rapidly. Filth wasn't just unpleasant. It threatened the stability of entire populations. Reformers began pushing for public bathhouses, not as luxury spas, but as instrument of public health and moral discipline. These facilities provided access to clean water for the poor, taught habits of personal hygiene, encouraged gender-segregated modesty and routine. London opened its first public bathhouse in 1842. Others followed across Europe and the United States. By the 1860s, Bath and Wash Houses Acts were passed, allowing municipal governments to build and maintain hygiene facilities. In these new institutions, bathing became associated with virtue, productivity, and even patriotism. Soap, once feared and taxed, began to take on new meaning. The Industrial Revolution allowed for mass production of soap, making it cheaper and more accessible. Innovations in chemistry led to better lathering, gentler formulas, and eventually the marketing of toilet soap. Soap meant for skin, not just laundry or dishes. By the late 19th century, soap had become a medical tool in surgery and obstetrics, a public health requirement in schools and military barracks, a consumer good marketed with slogans like "Cleanliness is next to godliness." Soap makers like Pears, Lever Brothers, and later Procter & Gamble began advertising campaigns tying cleanliness to morality, modernity, and national pride. For the first time in centuries, to be clean was to be good, but the story doesn't end with virtue. The return of bathing was also political and imperial. As European empires expanded into Africa, Asia, and the Middle East, colonizers imposed not just governance, but hygiene standards. Soap baths and sanitary science were exported as signs of civilization. Public health campaigns in colonies often had dual purposes: preventing disease outbreaks that could weaken imperial control, instilling European values of order, discipline, and cleanliness. In this context, bathing became an act of power. To wash was not just to be clean. It was to be European, modern, civilized. And for colonized peoples, resistance to these imposed hygiene regimes sometimes became acts of cultural defiance. Despite reform, not everyone embraced a bath overnight. Many working-class families, especially in colder climates, saw weekly bathing as difficult, expensive, or unnecessary. Soap still stung the eyes. Water still took effort to heat. And old fears of pores, chills, and sudden illness persisted in folk belief. In fact, well into the early 20th century, some communities still believed that bathing weakened the body, especially during pregnancy, menstruation, or after childbirth. But with the rise of compulsory education, public health campaigns, and mass marketing, these beliefs finally began to erode. By the dawn of the 20th century, the transformation was complete. Bathing, once condemned, feared, or ignored, was now a ritual, a right, and a responsibility. The bathroom became a standard room in new homes. Soap companies became household names, and diseases like cholera and typhoid, once endemic, began to vanish from industrialized cities. What had been superstition was now science. What had been a danger was now a defense. But the speed of the change obscures just how strange it is. Less than 150 years ago, it was common for the average European to go months without bathing and to fear water as a vector of death. So then we must ask, if even something as simple and obvious as soap had to fight centuries of fear and ignorance, what other obvious truths might we be wrong about today? In our modern world, cleanliness is nearly inseparable from identity. It's not just something we do, it defines who we are. We judge people by their scent, by the appearance of their homes, by how often they shower. Clean is good, dirty is dangerous. But this mindset is surprisingly new. In this final section, we trace the rise of cleanliness as ideology, how industrial soap marketing reshaped our values, how governments and corporations made hygiene a moral imperative, and how the obsession with germs eventually gave birth to a culture of sterilization, fear, and control. From Victorian filth to modern antimicrobial wipes, this is a strange and winding story of how humanity went from fearing baths to fearing not bathing. With the popularization of germ theory and urban sanitation in the late 19th century, cleanliness became a commodity. Soap manufacturers quickly recognized an opportunity. If germs were everywhere, and if soap was a solution, then fear could be monetized. Advertisements from this period didn't just sell a product. They sold social acceptance, romantic success, and even racial and moral superiority. Some examples. Lifebuoy soap warned, "BO body odor destroys charm." Pear soap ran ads with children scrubbing away native dirt, promoting cleanliness as a mark of whiteness and modernity. Ivory soap boasted it was 99 and 44/100% pure, redefining purity in both chemical and moral terms. In these campaigns, to be dirty was not just unhealthy, it was unworthy. The bath had become a confessional, the soap a sacrament. As understanding of microbes grew, so did a powerful cultural shift. Germs became the new demons. This intensified in the early 20th century with the 1918 Spanish flu pandemic, which killed tens of millions. World War I, where trench diseases highlighted hygiene failures. The rise of antiseptics and disinfectants in hospitals. Governments and corporations launched massive public hygiene campaigns. Schools taught hand washing. Mothers were told their children's survival depended on daily cleaning rituals. Germs, invisible and omnipresent, became an object of both science and fear. Soap was no longer just about cleanliness. It was about survival. Even as plumbing spread, disparities remained. In wealthy homes, large bathtubs, soft towels, and branded soaps became signs of refinement. In working-class or rural homes, a weekly bath in the kitchen was the norm well into the mid-20th century. A single bar of soap served multiple purposes, for hands, dishes, and laundry alike. But advertising didn't care. It set a universal standard. A spotless home meant a good mother. A sweet-smelling child meant a healthy family. A clean-shaven man meant reliability. Failed to meet these standards, and you weren't just unclean, you were undesirable. This created a new kind of anxiety, not just about health, but about social acceptance. In the second half of the 20th century, cleanliness escalated into something else: sterility. With the invention of antibacterial soaps, bleach products, and disposable everything, the definition of clean changed again. Now, it wasn't just about removing dirt. It was about eradicating all life from surfaces. Hospitals led the way, but the home soon followed. Kitchens were disinfected daily. Advertisements showed mothers wiping doorknobs with chemical wipes. Children were taught to fear germs more than insects or strangers. By the 1990s and 2000s, cleanliness had become warfare. And in that war, soap was no longer enough. You needed antibacterial hand gels, sanitizing sprays, UV light wands, and 99.9% germ kill claims to feel truly safe. The COVID-19 pandemic of 2020 brought all of these historical currents to a head. Suddenly, hand washing, once a private ritual, became a public duty. Signs in every building reminded us to scrub for at least 20 seconds. Sales of soap, sanitizer, and disinfectant soared. People wiped down groceries, left packages in the sun, and avoided touching railings or elevator buttons. Cleanliness became a symbol of care, but also of fear. But just like in medieval times, confusion and contradiction crept in. Were we cleaning too much? Was soap better than sanitizer? Could cleaning make us sick by weakening our immune systems? We had come full circle. Still afraid, still unsure, still seeking safety and ritual. Ironically, overcleanliness may now be a public health risk. Scientists warn of the hygiene hypothesis, the idea that children raised in overly sterile environments may develop weaker immune systems, leading to higher rates of allergies and autoimmune disorders. Just as the medieval world feared bathing for letting in bad air, the modern world fears dirt for letting in microbes. But in both cases, extremes led to unexpected vulnerabilities. We have conquered filth, but now we may need to relearn how to live with dirt in healthy balance. Cleanliness has always been about more than health. It is also about power. Governments use hygiene laws to regulate behavior. Companies shape personal routines through advertising. Social norms enforce hygiene standards, punishing those who fall outside them. Cleanliness controls space. Who gets to eat where, sit where, live where. It controls bodies. Who is considered attractive, healthy, trustworthy. And it defines morality in subtle ways. We say someone is clean when we mean they are sober, honest, pure. The word dirty still implies shame, failure, danger. Cleanliness, then, is not just about soap. It's about status, surveillance, and survival. As you drift into sleep tonight, consider how strange this journey has been. From monks scrubbing in medieval bathhouses, to doctors warning against open pores, to war nurses discovering the power of hand washing, to children lathering with cartoon-branded soap. Cleanliness is not fixed. It is a story told differently in every century. So the next time you stand under a stream of hot water or unwrap a fresh bar of soap, remember, for much of history, that simple act would have made you suspicious, sinful, or even dead. And perhaps ask yourself, are you cleaning to stay healthy, or because the world told you to fear being anything less than spotless? Today, if you want something cold, a drink, a meal, or even an entire room, you push a button or open a door. Refrigerators and freezers hum quietly in the background of modern life, unnoticed and uncelebrated. But only 2 centuries ago, keeping something cold required enormous physical effort, deep planning, and seasonal labor tied entirely to the whims of nature. Welcome to the world of ice harvesting, a forgotten industry that shaped diets, cities, medicine, and global trade. This is a story of how humans tamed winter, not with electricity, but with axes, saws, and shivering laborers who cut, stored, and shipped millions of tons of ice long before artificial refrigeration ever existed. The story begins in New England in the early 1800s. While cold climates had always used ice to store perishables, it wasn't until a Bostonian entrepreneur named Frederick Tudor came along that ice became a global commodity. In 1806, Tudor had an idea that seemed absurd. He wanted to export ice from frozen American lakes to tropical countries. His first shipment, 130 tons of Massachusetts pond ice packed in sawdust and loaded onto a ship bound for the Caribbean, melted into loss and laughter. Newspapers mocked him. No one believed ice could survive the journey, or that anyone would want it in the first place. But Tudor persisted. By perfecting insulation methods using sawdust, straw, and tightly packed ice blocks, he eventually succeeded. By the 1830s, ice was arriving, solid and intact, in Cuba, India, and Brazil. Tudor had become the ice king, and the age of natural ice had begun. To understand how ice harvesting worked, we must understand the ice house, a structure as common in the 19th century as the refrigerator is today. These were sunken, insulated buildings, often dug partially into the ground and packed with straw or sawdust, where massive blocks of ice were stored year-round. Ice houses range from simple pits lined with stone to elaborate wooden structures with ventilation systems and drainage. Every winter, as lakes and rivers froze thick, laborers would clear the snow from the surface to ensure clear, solid ice, score the ice into grids using horse-drawn plows or hand tools, saw the blocks by hand or with large-toothed ice saws, float the blocks down channels cut in the ice, guiding them to shore, hoist and stack them into ice houses, layered tightly to reduce melting. Each block weighed 100 to 300 pounds. Men worked in bitter cold, often soaked and frostbitten, risking death by drowning if they misstepped. It was grueling, dangerous, and often underpaid. But it was also critical. By the mid-19th century, ice had become a silent pillar of modernity. City dwellers needed it to preserve milk, meat, and fish in ice boxes, insulated wooden cabinets. Doctors used it to reduce fevers, transport vaccines, and preserve cadavers. Food vendors use it to chill butter, fruit, and oysters, especially in sweltering urban summers. Bartenders and hotels use it to offer novelty drinks with crushed or shaved ice, a luxury previously unknown. Even wealthy homes install private ice houses, sometimes hidden behind a kitchen, stocked annually from nearby lakes or delivered by ice wagons. In effect, access to cold became a class marker. The very poor drank sour milk and spoiled meat. The middle and upper classes had ice boxes, which meant longer-lasting food and better health. Cold had become a resource, and like all resources, it was unevenly distributed. Frederick Tudor's vision of a global ice trade had become reality by the 1850s. Massive quantities of ice were being shipped from New England to the Caribbean, India and Australia, Norway to Britain and continental Europe, Russia to Iran and the Mediterranean. Ships were specially refitted to carry insulated holds, and ice loss and melting was factored into pricing. Some estimates suggest that over 50,000 tons of ice were shipped to India per year, a staggering feat when you consider that it had to survive weeks at sea through tropical waters. Entire cities like Calcutta, Havana, and New Orleans became dependent on ice from across the globe, and yet all of it came from frozen lakes, hand-cut by workers braving the winter. Ice harvesting was a winter-only industry, meaning it employed thousands of seasonal workers. Farmers, who took on ice work in winter months when crops were dormant. Immigrants, especially Irish and Scandinavian men, who faced limited employment in other trades. Children, often employed to sweep, stack, or pack sawdust for insulation. These workers were exposed to sub-zero temperatures, often in wet clothing, falling hazards from slick surfaces and collapsing stacks, back-breaking labor, hoisting ice into wagons or ships by hand. In some regions, death by drowning or exposure was a regular occurrence. Yet for many, ice work paid better than factory labor and provided a crucial financial bridge between agricultural seasons. In a world before cold chains and artificial cooling, this seasonal struggle kept cities alive. Ice harvesting also influenced how people lived their lives. Cold meant food lasted longer, but only if you timed your purchase with the ice wagon's delivery. Milk could be drunk fresh, but only if it was stored carefully. A corpse could be preserved for viewing, but only for a few days in a cooling coffin packed with ice. Time and cold were now interlinked. Ice delayed decay, slowed time, and created a margin for modern life. But this margin was thin. Ice melted. Deliveries failed. And when a shipment was delayed or a harvest failed due to warm winters, entire systems collapsed. Grocers lost inventory, hospitals scrambled, and the poor went without, which leads to a chilling question. What happened when the lakes didn't freeze? For nearly a century, ice harvesting reigned supreme as the backbone of food preservation, medical logistics, and even leisure. Blocks of frozen lake water traveled thousands of miles, chilled cities, and even helped doctors save lives. But underneath this seemingly indestructible trade was a fatal weakness. It relied entirely on nature. If the winter was too warm, if the lakes didn't freeze, or the ice harvest was too thin, the whole system teetered. In such years, prices soared. Grocers panicked. Milk spoiled. Meat turned. And just as this fragility became clear, a new force emerged from workshops, patents, and laboratories: artificial refrigeration. It was messy, unreliable, and laughably experimental at first. But soon, man wouldn't have a cut winter out of a lake. He would build it in a machine. In the 1880s, New England suffered several mild winters in a row. The lakes, once a reliable source of thick ice, froze too late or too shallow. The harvest was delayed or diminished. Ice houses sat half empty. Cities that depended on New England ice, especially in the American South and in tropical colonies, faced crisis. Hospitals struggled to preserve medications. Food spoiled in bulk. Prices for stored ice surged. And for the first time, a question began circulating not just in factories, but among merchants and policymakers. In 1834, Inventor Jacob Perkins had already created a rudimentary ice-making machine using compression and expansion of ether, a volatile refrigerant. His design worked, but it was expensive, dangerous, and not commercially viable. Over the next decades, others built on his idea. James Harrison of Australia developed an ether-based machine that was used to make ice for breweries. Carl von Linde in Germany introduced more reliable compression-based cooling using ammonia. These early machines were bulky, loud, and often prone to leaks or explosions, but they offered something radical: independence from weather. By the 1870s and 1880s, artificial ice production was starting to appear in breweries, meatpacking plants, and urban ice factories. The writing was on the ice house wall, but the transition was not smooth. The natural ice industry, long established and politically connected, fought back. They insisted that artificial ice was unhealthy, contaminated by chemicals. Natural ice was purer, harvested from clean lakes and rivers. The taste of drinks and the preservation of food were superior with natural ice. These claims often found traction, especially among wealthy customers. But it was increasingly hard to argue with year-round, reliable ice from a machine. Factories could make ice in summer, scale production, and lower prices over time. Plus, they weren't vulnerable to unpredictable weather or regional shortages. Eventually, even natural ice distributors began supplementing with, or switching entirely to, machine-made ice. By the early 20th century, ice plants had appeared in nearly every major city. These plants used ammonia or CO2-based compression systems, created uniform blocks that could be shipped, shaved, or stored, operated independent of climate or geography. In turn, the urban ice delivery system evolved. Ice wagons made daily rounds, delivering 25 to 50-pound blocks to homes with ice boxes. Children would chase after the wagons, hoping for free shards. Households posted small signs in their windows, showing how much ice they needed that day. The ice box, a wooden cabinet lined with tin or zinc, with a space for an ice block, became a fixture of middle-class life. Cold, once a luxury, was now standard in urban homes. But this new ice was born not in lakes, but in factories, and its dominance grew with every passing year. As artificial ice spread, the old harvest economy began to unravel. Ice houses were emptied and abandoned. Seasonal labor dried up. Entire lake communities built around the winter trade faced economic collapse. By the 1920s, few cities still relied on harvested lake ice. By the 1930s, it was largely gone from commerce. A few communities in remote areas held on, but only out of nostalgia or necessity. Once a global trade, natural ice became a historical curiosity. And yet, something was lost, not just a livelihood, but an entire way of relating to nature, time, and cold. Just as machines had industrialized ice at scale, inventors now turned to the home. Early attempts at electric refrigerators were costly, loud, and sometimes dangerous due to toxic gases like methyl chloride. But by the 1930s, safer refrigerants like Freon emerged. Electricity became more widespread and reliable. Refrigerator prices fell into reach of middle-class homes. By the 1940s and 1950s, the modern refrigerator had replaced the icebox entirely. With it, ice was no longer delivered. It was made on demand, a frozen lake in your kitchen. The last trace of the old ice economy, the ice delivery man, disappeared in most cities by the 1950s. This transformation wasn't just technological. It was philosophical. Refrigeration made it possible to store food longer, reducing spoilage and food waste, expand diets, allowing for fresh produce, dairy, and meat even in remote locations, change global trade, enabling frozen food shipment across oceans. Cold became expected. Ice became invisible. The season no longer mattered. The harvest no longer mattered. Time was bent to human will. But as we gained this mastery, we also severed our connection to the cyclical rhythms that once governed everything we ate, drank, and preserved. Which raises a strange modern question. What do we lose when we no longer know what it takes to make something cold? Once artificial refrigeration entered the home, it didn't stop there. It infiltrated ships, trucks, planes, hospitals, and power grids. Cold became a system, not a season. In this final section, we explore how refrigeration transformed the rhythms of daily life, the architecture of cities, and the nature of global trade, and how, in the quietest corners of winter, a few still harvest ice by hand, not for necessity, but from memory. The most profound impact of refrigeration came in the form of the cold chain, an unbroken sequence of temperature-controlled environments that allow goods to remain fresh from source to destination. Today, this chain powers global food systems, enabling strawberries from Chile in a New York winter, vaccine distribution, requiring precise temperature controls across borders, organ transplants and blood supplies, where survival hinges on refrigeration. Entire industries now exist within the cold chain's logic. Supermarkets, logistics firms, pharmaceuticals, all rely on uninterrupted cold. When a link in the chain breaks, say during a blackout or a border delay, millions of dollars and lives can be at risk. Yet the system, so vast and powerful, is also fragile, dependent on energy, infrastructure, and a perfectly timed ballet of technology. Before refrigeration, diets were seasonal, regional, and tied to storage skills. Pickling, salting, drying. Meals were dictated by the weather and harvest cycles. After refrigeration, food became global, with pineapples in Poland and fish in the desert, standardized, with shelf lives, expiration dates, and packaging rules, disconnected from the land that produced it. This change didn't just affect nutrition. It altered culture. Food lost some of its local identity. Traditions tied to seasonal scarcity, like root cellaring or ice cream as a summer-only treat, began to fade. Cold had democratized freshness, but at the cost of intimacy with the Earth's cycles. Cities themselves were reshaped by refrigeration. Before, urban dwellers depended on daily food markets, ice deliveries, and short-term storage. Now, apartment layouts were redesigned around the refrigerator. Grocery shopping shifted from daily to weekly routines. 24-hour refrigeration enabled all-day dining, frozen convenience foods, and even vending machines. Restaurants no longer needed cellars or ice deliveries. Hospitals could store blood and vaccines on site. Butchers, fishmongers, dairies, all industries transformed, sometimes painfully. The butcher's block gave way to the vacuum-sealed tray. The neighborhood milkman was replaced by cold shelving and self-service. And while this meant safety and efficiency, it also meant the end of a more personal food economy, where your iceman, grocer, or fish seller knew your name. Refrigeration even changed how we think. We expect things to last. Refrigeration taught us that decay is negotiable, that time can be paused. We trust packages over people. Food is clean if it's chilled and sealed, regardless of its origin or handling. We fear spoilage, but are detached from its causes. We toss food based on labels, not smell, taste, or touch. Cold, in this sense, became a metaphor for control, a quiet belief that nature could be held at bay indefinitely by machines. Yet this illusion requires constant power, constant vigilance, and global coordination. Without them, food spoils, vaccines fail, and hospitals go dark. In other words, the world as we know it is chilled, and chilling is fragile. And still, in a few snowy corners of the world, the old way lives on. In small towns in Vermont, Japan, Norway, and Finland, winter still brings men and women onto frozen lakes to harvest ice by hand. Not out of necessity, but tradition, ceremony, and remembrance. One such place is Brookfield, Vermont, where each January, volunteers cut ice from the town pond using antique saws. They pack it in sawdust and store it in the community ice house, as was done a century ago. In summer, the ice is shared during festivals, cold lemonade from last winter's labor. In Japan's Nagano Prefecture, premium natural ice is harvested from mountain ponds and sold to high-end bars and dessert shops. It melts slower, carves beautifully, and fetches a price that honors the work. These modern harvests are not quaint reenactments. They are acts of historical continuity, reminders that cold, once so hard-earned, is not just about luxury. It was survival. It was a season. It was a ritual. As you sleep, tucked under synthetic blankets and cooled by quietly humming machines, think of the men knee-deep in snow, guiding a block of ice down a wooden chute. Think of the horses, the iron saws, the stacked towers of ice glowing dimly in straw-lined barns. Think of summer lemonade chilled by winter's memory. And ask yourself, have we forgotten what cold once cost? And if we ever had to it again, could we? When you imagine ancient empires, you may think of emperors in golden robes, palaces filled with jade, or armies marching under silk banners. But empires don't run on silk or swords alone. They run on information, timely, accurate, controlled. And in 7th century China, during the height of the Tang dynasty, that information flowed not through scrolls and libraries, but on horseback and foot, carried along a vast network of postal relay stations stretching across thousands of miles. This was not a romantic system of love letters and poetry. It was a logistical marvel, built with discipline, surveillance, sacrifice, and more than a little blood. It was a circulatory system of the Tang state, connecting borders to court, provinces to palace, governors to generals. In this section, we'll explore the structure, scale, and significance of the Tang postal system, how it was built, how it operated, and how a message could outpace a rebellion, collapse a governor, or change the course of history before the ink was even dry. The Tang dynasty, 618 to 907 CE, ruled over one of the most powerful and cosmopolitan empires the world had ever seen. At its peak, the empire stretched from the Korean peninsula to modern-day Afghanistan, encompassing mountains, deserts, steppes, rivers, and cities teeming with scholars, merchants, and soldiers. Its capital, Chang'an, was the largest city on earth, home to more than 1 million people. To govern such a realm, the emperor needed more than armies and taxes. He needed intelligence. Not espionage, though that played a role, but raw information, reports from border garrisons, tax records from distant provinces, orders to generals, summons to poets and ministers. And this information needed to move, faster than rebels, faster than rumors. The solution? A vast relay courier system, inherited and expanded from earlier dynasties, but refined to imperial perfection. At the core of Tang communication was the Yichuan system, a network of relay stations spaced at regular intervals along major roads. Here's how it worked. Every 30 to 40 li, 15, 20 kilometers, a relay station, /yijan, was maintained by local governments. Each station was staffed with couriers, stable hands, cooks, and relay officials ready day or night. Couriers would arrive, dismount, hand off the mail, and rest while the next rider continued the journey. This leapfrogging allowed messages to travel astonishing distances. A single dispatch from the western frontier to Chang'an, a journey of over 1,000 miles, could arrive in just 10 days during emergencies. Important messages were marked with urgent seals. Their speed depended on their classification. Some were sent by galloping courier, /Feiqi maximum speed, non-stop change of horses. Light dispatch, /Xingji quick, but non-emergency. Regular courier, /Pingxin normal bureaucratic communication. Nothing was more critical than speed and chain of custody. The system was backed by infrastructure both physical and social. Roads were maintained not just for travel, but for message flow. Inns and rest stops catered specifically to postal riders. Horses were state-owned, rotated, and tracked to prevent overuse. Each station was also a node of surveillance. Relay officers were expected to monitor who came and went, record delays, weather, or unusual travel, report suspicious movements or missing riders. In effect, the postal system became a web of quiet intelligence, a way to monitor the empire not just from palace to frontier, but frontier to palace. Though the Tang relay system was highly organized, it was far from easy. Postal couriers, often drawn from commoner or military families, faced dangers such as bandits, especially in border regions, harsh weather, from desert heat to mountain frost, overwork, particularly during military campaigns. Couriers were often expected to ride day and night, stopping only long enough to eat or swap horses. Those who failed to deliver on time faced punishment, including beatings or demotion. Those who lost messages or allowed them to be tampered with could be executed. And yet, despite the dangers, the position offered stability and, in some cases, upward mobility. Some successful riders, especially those who served during military emergencies, were rewarded with gifts, stipends, or small posts. But most remained nameless, galloping through dust and rain with orders that could shift the fate of provinces. What made the Tang system unique wasn't just its speed, but its bureaucratic integration. Every message was part of a chain of paperwork. It began with a written order, typically penned by a magistrate, minister, or general. It was registered and stamped at the dispatching office. At each relay station, the message was checked, logged, and handed off. Upon arrival, it was recorded and a confirmation was sent back. This created a paper trail of accountability, ensuring that corruption or delay could be traced and punished. It was also an act of imperial performance. Every letter carried not just ink, but the authority of the emperor. The message was the state itself in motion. Some of the most consequential events in Tang history were shaped or even determined by postal speed. In 755 CE, when General Lu Xun launched his devastating rebellion, the imperial court scrambled to send urgent messages across the realm. Provinces that received the dispatches early raised defenses. Those that did not were overrun. During military campaigns against the Tibetan Empire and Turkic nomads, generals often waited days in tents for courier reports before acting. In times of succession crisis or ministerial purges, who knew what and when often decided who lived and who died. This system wasn't just delivering news. It was delivering decisions, judgments, life and death. So as the rider galloped into the dusk, scroll tied to his sash, wind biting at his sleeves, the world behind him held its breath. Would he arrive in time? Would the rebellion be stopped? Would the court hear the truth or a lie? And in that question hangs a legacy. By now, you've met the bones of the Tang postal system. Relay stations, galloping couriers, and scrolls sealed with wax and fear. But behind the infrastructure was something more subtle, culture in motion. The Tang dynasty is remembered as a golden age of poetry, art, and cosmopolitan exchange. And the same system that moved imperial decrees also moved verses, confessions, secret reports, and the last advice of those exiled beyond the map. In this section, we dive into how the Tang postal system became a mirror of the empire's soul, used by poets to reach distant hearts, by spies to signal danger, and by emperors to control the very narrative of reality. The Tang dynasty was perhaps the most literary era in Chinese history. Nearly every educated man and many women wrote poetry, and they wrote constantly. But poems in the Tang were not just artistic expressions. They were gifts, replies, pleas, and diagnoses of the soul, often exchanged by posts between scholars, exiles, lovers, and friends separated by long distances. The postal network allowed court poets in Chang'an to correspond with hermit monks in the mountains, friends serving in distant provinces to exchange couplets about longing, politics, or aging, students to send their first verses to mentors. Many famous poems by Li Bai, Du Fu, and Wang Wei are explicitly framed as letters, sent across rivers and deserts, hoping for reply. These were not fast messages. A poem could take weeks to arrive, and longer to answer, but they moved because the system worked, even if slowly. And in moving, they knit the empire together in shared language and feeling. For those who fell out of favor, officials, scholars, sometimes even princes, the postal system offered a thin thread to the world left behind. Exile in the Tang era was a common punishment. Those demoted from court were often sent to remote provinces, nominally to serve but effectively to disappear. Some were sent to coastal outposts, others to desert borders or mountain garrisons. In such isolation, the postal system became a lifeline. Exiles wrote petitions pleading for pardon. They sent poetry to friends at court, hoping for mercy or memory. Some sent coded messages, using literary allusion to convey danger or injustice. The court, aware of this, monitored mail from exiles carefully. Some letters were intercepted, censored, or destroyed. Others were allowed through, especially if they demonstrated submission or repentance. In this way, the system was both liberating and surveilling, a conduit and a cage. Beyond poetry and politics, the Tang Relay Network also carried espionage. The Tang court maintained an intelligence apparatus known as the Jianxia Yuan Shu, a kind of internal watchdog agency. These officials traveled under secrecy, often using the postal roads, gathering information on, provincial governors suspected of disloyalty, military officers hoarding power, religious movements, or border unrest. Their reports were often delivered by trusted couriers directly to the Centuriate or the emperor, bypassing local channels. But the very existence of this network meant fear. Governors watched what they wrote. Officials second-guessed their correspondence. Even family letters were toned down for fear of being misread or intercepted. The system, originally built for efficiency, had become a surveillance engine, one that produced not just communication but control. Because of the postal system, people across the Tang Empire, whether in border towns or imperial halls, shared more than just information. They shared a mental map of the empire. Everyone knew where the major relay routes ran, how long it took to reach the capital, what direction military dispatches moved in times of crisis. This shared geography allowed even distant peasants to feel connected to the center. It wasn't just bureaucracy. It was a cultural nervous system, helping form what we now call national consciousness. And yet, this unity came with a price. Every message bound the sender and receiver to the state. Every letter passed through imperial eyes. Despite its brilliance, the system wasn't invincible. Rebellions, especially during the Lushan Rebellion, 755 to 763 CE, often began by cutting postal routes, choking off communication between court and province. The speed at which messages could move made the system powerful, but it also made it vulnerable. A single broken relay station could isolate entire provinces. A mutinous general could fabricate dispatches. In some cases, false messages were sent intentionally to confuse enemy governors or the emperor himself. This forced the court to rely not just on speed, but on cross-verification, independent envoys, and coded seals. Reliability became as important as velocity. Perhaps the most haunting aspect of the Tang postal system was its use by the emperor to project his presence. Imperial edicts, delivered by post, arrived in silk-wrapped scrolls, carried by mounted officials wearing distinctive sashes and bells. When a courier approached a provincial capital, bells were rung, town officials summoned, and the scroll was read aloud in the public square. The emperor might be 1,000 miles away, but his voice rang through the streets. Clear, immediate, and final. This moment was not just administrative. It was ritual. It reminded everyone that power flowed not from proximity, but from connection. Even if you never saw the emperor, you heard him regularly, predictably, via the very roads and hands you relied upon. So, as the sun set over the desert passes and the courier entered a distant garrison, message tucked under his sash, he wasn't just delivering words. He was delivering presence, authority, memory, a poet's sigh, a general's order, an emperor's whisper. At its height, the Tang postal system was a marvel of bureaucratic engineering. 10,000 li of silk roads, hundreds of relay stations, tens of thousands of horses and couriers, all coordinated to keep the imperial heart beating in sync with the farthest provinces. But no system, no matter how efficient or intricate, is immune to the forces of time: war, politics, corruption, and collapse. In this final section, we explore how this great arterial network began to falter and fracture, what replaced it or failed to, and how echoes of the Tang postal system continue to inform how we communicate, govern, and surveil, even in today's age of instant messages and digital wire. As the Tang dynasty progressed into the 8th and 9th centuries, several vulnerabilities in the postal system began to emerge. Over-centralization. Because everything ran through Chang'an, any disruption to the capital paralyzed the network. Bureaucratic bloat, relay officers, riders, and inspectors multiplied, but efficiency did not. Corruption, nepotism, and ghost employees became common. Costs. Maintaining thousands of horses, buildings, and couriers strained provincial budgets, especially in times of drought or famine. Ironically, the very rigidity that made the system trustworthy also made it inflexible in times of rapid change. The most significant blow came during the Lushan Rebellion, 755 to 763 CE, one of the most devastating civil wars in Chinese history. Lushan, a general of mixed Sogdian and Turkic origin, turned against the Tang court and marched his forces toward Chang'an. In the chaos that followed, relay stations were destroyed or seized by rebels. Messages were delayed, falsified, or lost. Entire regions became communications dead zones. The once reliable system was weaponized. Loyalist generals could not communicate quickly. Some provinces never received orders. Others received contradictory dispatches. The rebellion ultimately led to millions of deaths and permanent weakening of central authority. The postal system was eventually restored, but it was never the same. In the later Tang period, the empire splintered into de facto autonomous regions, each led by military governors Jidushi, who often maintained their own courier systems. Some followed Tang protocol. Others ignored it. Parallel systems began to emerge, smaller, faster, but less accountable. Regional warlords began intercepting imperial mail. Trust in the central relay system eroded. As a result, the flow of information slowed, and with it, the reach of imperial will. The emperor still sent orders, but fewer obeyed. In many ways, the postal system died before the dynasty did. By 907 CE, the Tang dynasty officially collapsed. China entered a period of fragmentation known as the Five Dynasties and Ten Kingdoms era. During this time, the national postal system ceased to function at scale. Some regional rulers maintained rudimentary courier services, but none matched Tang's sophistication. Roads fell into disrepair. Horses were repurposed for war, and communication once again became dangerous and slow. It wasn't until the rise of the Song dynasty that attempts were made to revive a centralized postal system, but it would be different, more restricted, and less expansive. The golden age of the Tang Post was over. With the fall of the network came more than inconvenience. Provincial crises went unreported. Local uprisings went unnoticed. Borders grew porous, and foreign relations deteriorated. The court no longer knew what was happening beyond its walls. The empire became blind, deaf, and dumb, a fatal condition for any centralized state. And the people? They once again relied on word-of-mouth merchant routes, or religious pilgrims to hear of laws, taxes, or wars. Misinformation flourished. Authority weakened. Identity fractured. The once shared mental map of the empire faded into fog. So what did the Tang postal system leave behind? Blueprints. Later dynasties like the Song, Yuan, Ming, and Qing all built on Tang models, some even resurrecting old relay routes. Cultural memory. Poems and records survived, immortalizing couriers, stations, and dispatches. Modern analogs. The logic of the relay station echoes today in server nodes on a digital network, last-mile logistics in e-commerce, government courier routes, and diplomatic pouches. Even today, our systems rely on trust, continuity, and chain of custody, all concepts pioneered in ancient Chang'an. In rural China, some relay stations still stand. Crumbling structures in forgotten valleys, stone markers with faded script. A few have been restored as cultural heritage sites. In Shaanxi province, old postal inns have been turned into museums. In Gansu, roads that once carried imperial messages are now used by mail trucks. Some ancient post roads have even been repurposed into modern highways. History paved over but still traveled. And in the digital world, China's modern postal system, China Post, with its nationwide grid, arguably descends from Tang administrative DNA. The messengers ride motorcycles now. The scrolls are replaced by plastic parcels. But the message still moves. As you sleep. Think of the courier slipping through mountain fog. The scroll wrapped in silk at his waist. The seal unbroken. He doesn't know what it says. He doesn't need to. His job is to move truth through space. Empires don't rise on armies alone. They rise on shared knowledge, timely decisions, and the quiet certainty that a message will arrive when it must. But when the roads break, when the message halts, an empire learns what it is without its voice. Somewhere in forgotten archive, a letter lies unopened. The seal is cracked. The ink is faded. The paper is thin, yellowed, and brittle. It was written in haste, perhaps in fear or love or resignation, but it was never received. Never read. Never applied to. This is not an isolated story. Across history, empires rose on the backs of messengers, scribes, postal clerks, and seals. But for every scroll delivered in time, every edict shouted from a balcony, there were letters that vanished, the dead letters of empire. In this story, we'll explore the strange fate of undelivered mail, how it happened, why it mattered, and what these lost messages reveal about the fragility of communication in an age before inboxes and timestamps. This is a history of missed messages and the echoes they left behind. The letter has always been more than words on a page. In the ancient world, to send a letter was to engage in an act of trust and vulnerability. A letter implied time, that both the writer and recipient would still be alive when it arrived. Space, that a messenger could cross rivers, deserts, oceans. Stability, that no war, rebellion, or storm would intervene. To write was to hope, and to wait was to suffer, which is why the moment of non-arrival was so haunting. A letter undelivered is a moment suspended forever, a question with no answer, a warning unheard, a confession unresolved. Let us begin in the Victorian era, where the term dead letter office became formalized. In 19th century Britain and America, undeliverable mail was sent to a central facility, stamped dead, to be opened, examined, and if possible, returned to sender. If no return address existed, the letter was destroyed, archived, or in rare cases, stolen. In 1873 alone, the U.S. Dead Letter Office handled over 4 million pieces of undeliverable mail. Among them, wedding invitations mailed to grooms killed in war, job applications to collapsed businesses, love letters to mistyped addresses, never opened, never replied to, packages containing hair, teeth, religious relics, or even live animals. Clerks became part detectives, part priests, sorting through grief, bureaucracy, and heartbreak with rubber gloves and black ink. Some letters never arrived by design. Empires often intercepted mail during times of war, rebellion, or political unrest. Postal inspectors, censors, and spies quietly opened letters in Imperial Russia, where the third section monitored correspondence of dissidents and nobles alike. British India, where colonial postmasters read letters from Muslims, Sikhs, and Hindu reformers. Nazi Germany, where the Gestapo tracked coded messages between Jewish families, resistance fighters, and exiles. These letters weren't lost. They were stolen, recorded, or destroyed. In some cases, intercepted letters became evidence in trials, or were used to map out entire social networks. But more often, they simply disappeared, leaving the sender to wonder why the world had gone silent. Oceans swallowed their share of messages. From the 16th to 19th centuries, as European empires expanded their colonies, ships carried tens of thousands of letters, from kings to governors, merchants to buyers, lovers to wives. When storms struck or ships vanished, the letters vanished too. Among them, Spanish galleons carrying silver and messages across the Atlantic, East India Company vessels laden with silk, spices, and correspondence. Immigrant letters from Irish and Italian families to loved ones in America never delivered. Some have been recovered centuries later, sealed in watertight containers or preserved in shipwrecks. In 2014, a stash of 17th century letters was found in a Dutch maritime archive, opened only recently by historians. One was from a woman begging her brother for money, another from a mother asking if her son had survived the crossing. No one ever replied. Some letters were silenced not by accident, but because they carried too much truth. In France, revolutionary figures like Camille Desmoulins and Madame Roland wrote letters from prison, many confiscated or burned after execution. In Tsarist Russia, prisoners in Siberia often attempted to smuggle letters to friends abroad. Most were seized, copied, or held until it was too late. In British-ruled Kenya, Mau Mau detainees wrote letters of protest and plea. Few made it out camps. These letters, if preserved, now form part of resistance archives, their delayed arrival transforming them from communications into historical testimony. But many were simply destroyed, and the voices with them. Empires understood that to stop a letter was to stop a movement. Silence became a tool of governance. Some empires even designed their postal systems to be deliberately slow or unreliable for certain groups: indigenous populations, political minorities, or border regions. In colonial Algeria, Berber communities saw their mail rerouted through multiple checkpoints, delays of weeks or months. In the Ottoman Empire, Armenian mail was often inspected or redirected before the genocide. In imperial China, during the late Qing, uprisings in provinces often coincided with the cutting of postal roads to isolate resistance from sympathy. These weren't bureaucratic accidents. They were strategic silences, a denial of voice, presence, and influence. So what happens to a world when the mail doesn't arrive? What happens when you say I'm alive and no one hears you? What happens when truth is written and dies in the dust, the water, or a drawer? History tends to remember what was said, published, declared. But sometimes the most haunting stories are those built around what was written but never heard. This section turns to personal narratives, real and documented cases of letters undelivered, unanswered, or intercepted. We'll examine how these lost messages reveal not only the failure of communication, but also the aching human need to reach out across time, space, and empire. These are not state secrets. These are missed goodbyes, wasted warnings, confessions in the void. In the aftermath of the Battle of Waterloo, 1815, as tens of thousands lay dead or wounded, the British Army struggled to sort, identify, and report casualties. Many families were left in the dark for weeks or months. One woman, Margaret Willoughby, wrote to her husband daily after the battle, unaware that he had died the morning after his final letter was sent. His letter survived, a tender note saying he was well, that the battle had gone in their favor, and that he'd be home soon. Her letters, posted faithfully for weeks after his death, were returned unopened, marked with a black seal. They were never opened by him. She never wrote again. Imprisoned in Reading Jail in 1897, Oscar Wilde penned a long, searing letter to his former lover, Lord Alfred Douglas, reflecting on love, betrayal, humiliation, and spiritual transformation. The letter, titled De Profundis, stretched over 50,000 words and was not allowed to be sent directly. Prison authorities insisted it be handed over only after Wilde's release. Douglas claimed he never received it, or at least never read in full. This delay turned Wilde's most vulnerable writing into something unread in its own time, an unread apology, indictment, and philosophical rebirth that lived only in archive for decades. It would take 50 years before it was published in full. And Frank's diary is famous. But what's less known is that she also wrote letters she never sent, intended for Kitty, a fictional friend. In her mind, these were real letters meant for someone on the outside to know her, remember her, understand her. They were not posted. They were hidden in a drawer in the secret annex left behind when the Nazis came. Had she survived, she may have posted them or rewritten them. But they were discovered after her death and published by her father. They became global artifacts of innocence destroyed, of thoughts trapped in place, of words meant for a reader who would never arrive. During the 900-day siege of Leningrad in World War II, postal delivery within the city often stopped entirely. Starving families resorted to burying letters in snow, hiding notes in books, or throwing messages over walls, hoping someone outside might find and deliver them. One preserved note, written by a 9-year-old girl named Tanya Savicheva, was not even a letter, but a diary made of dead names. Genya died on December 28, 1941. Grandma died on January 25, 1942. Lika died on March 17, 1942. Uncle Vazia died on April 13, 1942. Tanya is alone now. It was never mailed, but it survived, found in a bundle of rags after the war, and now displayed in a museum. A letter written to no one, received by everyone. In colonial empires, from British India to Dutch Java, from French Algeria to Portuguese Angola, thousands of letters from locals to colonial administrators were stored, ignored, or destroyed. Some were requests for land to be returned, for family members taken in raids, for punishment of abusive officials. Many were written in native languages, never translated. Others were sent with no hope of reply. In recent years, post-colonial historians have begun digging through these archives. They find bags of unopened mail, often kept for record-keeping rather than communication. Among them, a letter from an Indian widow in 1869, pleading for the return of her son, taken as an indentured laborer to Mauritius. No reply was ever recorded. The envelope was still sealed when discovered in 2011. During both World Wars, armies encouraged soldiers to write home, But censorship, invasion, or death meant many letters never reached their destinations. Some were returned unopened. Others were intercepted. Some were delivered long after the war had ended, to addresses that no longer existed, to families who had moved on or died. One particularly tragic example. In 1944, a British soldier wrote to his mother just before D-Day. His boat was sunk. His body never recovered. His letter, water-damaged but legible, washed ashore in 1946 and was delivered to the address on file, now a tobacco shop. The new occupant read the letter, then gave it to the local vicar, who put it in a drawer, who passed away in 1972. The letter was found in 1999 by the vicar's nephew, still unreturned. Some letters were never meant to arrive, but were written anyway. In Hiroshima, after the bombing, survivors wrote letters to the dead and burned them as offerings, telling lost family members what had happened. In post-genocide Rwanda, survivors carved letters into stones in mass graveyards. In modern refugee camps, children draw pictures meant for parents they haven't seen in years, placing them in plastic bags and taping them to fences. These are not letters in the postal sense, but they are attempts to reach someone, anyone, because the act of writing, even without delivery, is still a form of remembrance. So perhaps the saddest truth about undelivered letters is not just that they were missed, it's that they were never forgotten. The writers remembered every word. The recipients sometimes never knew, and history waited in silence. For centuries, dead letters were considered lost things, tragedies of logistics, accidents of war, or ghosts of bureaucracy. But in recent decades, historians, archivists, and even artists have begun to ask a powerful question: what if we read them anyway? In this final section, we explore the afterlife of undelivered mail, how forgotten letters have become windows into emotional histories, how entire research projects have been built around them, and how they remind us that even the most ordinary voices deserve to be heard, even if a century too late. Because sometimes a letter doesn't have to arrive on time. It just has to arrive eventually. In 2015, a Dutch researcher opened a dusty leather trunk in a French archive. Inside were 2,600 letters never delivered. They had been collected in Brienne-le-Château, a French postal hub during the 17th century. Many were written by Huguenot refugees, fleeing religious persecution. Others came from soldiers, merchants, or women left behind. These letters were never opened until now. Among them, a tailor begging his cousin for work after escaping to Holland, a young woman writing to her fiancé who had vanished into exile, a priest sending warnings to friends about incoming raids. A team of historians and linguists began translating and decoding the letters, revealing a world of displacement, desperation, and hope. For the first time, voices silenced by time were allowed to speak freely. In recent years, historical archives have become places not just for data, but for emotional archaeology. Projects like the Lost Letter Project, in which British historians catalog wartime letters that were intercepted or delayed. The Apartheid Archive, where South African families donate unsent or confiscated correspondence from political prisoners. The Refugee Archives Initiative, which collects letters from displaced persons never received due to war or migration. These collections are not just records. They are acts of dignity. They allow voices to re-enter history, not as victims, but as narrators. Contemporary artists and writers have also turned to these letters for inspiration. Rachel Lichtenstein, a British writer, turned a trove of Jewish family letters from pre-World War II Poland into a memoir documentary hybrid. And Lechia, a French artist, created installations using dead letters from colonial Algeria, projecting their texts onto walls like ghosts returning to speak. The More Than Words Project in the U.S. dramatized undelivered love letters from 19th century America in stage performances, giving literal voice to the voiceless. In each case, the dead letter is reimagined as a story waiting to be finished, not mourned. Some letters eventually do reach their destination, years, even decades later. A few examples. In 2009, a World War I soldier's letter to his mother was delivered in Kent, England, 93 years late. The family, now generations removed, gathered to read it aloud on Remembrance Day. In 2013, a German woman received a postcard sent by her sister in 1944, found during renovations in an old postal office wall. In 2020, a letter written in 1916 from a Scottish soldier to his wife was delivered after being found in a furniture auction. These events are rare, but when they happen, they're treated like sacred rituals, moments when time folds and silence ends. Today, our letters may not be handwritten, but our unread messages pile up in inboxes, draft folders, and cloud backups. And yes, some still go undelivered. Emails written in anger never sent. Messages from disaster zones never received. Final texts from phones recovered in war zones or earthquake rubble. The digital dead letter is different in form, but not in meaning. It still carries the same longing. Hear me, find me, remember me. And even now, archivists are beginning to preserve SMS histories, social media messages, and voicemail transcripts, because future historians will want to know what we wrote in times of fear, love, or loss. Letters are not just communications. They are acts of faith. Faith that we exist, that someone cares, that what we say matters. And when they go undelivered, it isn't just paper that's lost. It's the chance to be known. But maybe there's still something beautiful about the dead letter. It shows we tried. It shows we reached. And when read, even centuries late, it shows that some messages are stronger than time. So, tonight, if you've written something that never found its reader, remember, you are not alone. History is full of letters like yours, and some are still waiting to be read. In the modern world, the umbrella is so unremarkable that we rarely think about it. It sits by the door. It lives in glove compartments. It unfolds at the first sign of rain and disappears without comment. But in 18th century Paris, the umbrella was anything but mundane. To carry one was to defy social norms, threaten entire industries, and even risk violence in the streets. For a time, simply opening an umbrella in public marked you as arrogant, revolutionary, or dangerously bourgeois. And when the elite began to parade them openly, it set off a strange cascade of conflict, mockery, and rebellion, what would later be remembered as the Umbrella Riots. In this story, we will explore how a tool for staying dry became a symbol of class warfare, how humble innovations can challenge entrenched power, and how the seemingly trivial can trigger social transformation. Paris in the 1700s was a city of contradictions: wealth and poverty, filth and fashion, royal power and revolutionary ideas. But above all, it was a city of streets. Most Parisians walked. The streets were often unpaved, full of mud, waste, and refuse. Rain turned the boulevards into rivers of filth. Yet if you were poor, you had no choice but to trudge through it. The wealthy, however, rode in carriages, covered, elevated, private. This meant that getting wet wasn't just inconvenient. It was a class marker. If you were soaked, you were likely poor. If you were dry, you had mobility, money, and means. So when umbrellas began to appear in the hands of common citizens, social hierarchies were threatened in the most unexpected way. Umbrellas had existed in Europe for centuries, but mostly as parasols, used by noble women to block the sun, not rain. Their use was decorative, symbolic, and feminine. In the early 1700s, folding umbrellas began to appear in England and France, modeled after versions brought back from China and Persia. These were made of oiled silk, bamboo, and metal ribs, portable, sturdy, and ideal for rain. They were expensive, yes, but far cheaper than a carriage. And suddenly, a working-class man could stay dry in the rain without depending on the carriage trade. That, it turns out, was the real problem. The Parisian carriage guilds, coachmen, cab operators, and porters, saw the umbrella not as a novelty, but as an economic threat. Their business relied on bad weather. Rainy days meant more passengers. But if people could walk comfortably under umbrellas, they'd stop hiring coaches. So the guilds fought back, not through laws, but through intimidation. Historical records from the 1760s and 1770s reveal accounts of coachmen shouting insults at umbrella carriers, umbrellas being snatched, broken, or slashed, pedestrians being pushed into gutters or splashed with carriage wheels. In some cases, groups of coachmen would gang up on umbrella users, tearing apart the devices in public, all while laughing and jeering. It became known as the Umbrella Affair. Despite the harassment, umbrellas continued to spread, especially among middle-class professionals, lawyers, merchants, and students. Soon, police reports began to include umbrella incidents, fights, assaults, and property destruction. A few street pamphlets were even printed mocking the coachman as backward and thuggish. In 1769, a satirical newspaper printed this. It appears the umbrella is now deemed more offensive than a sword, for it shields the poor from wet and the rich from ridicule. The royal authorities did not outlaw umbrellas, but they did little to protect their users. The device became a symbol of bourgeois daring. To walk with one was to declare, "I am not wealthy, but I am independent." As umbrellas became more visible, so did their mockery. Cartoonists, writers, and poets jumped on the trend. One cartoon from 1775 shows a man being beaten with his own umbrella by a coachman, with the caption, "What are you doing?" Another poem, published anonymously, reads, "A pauper now may strut and stay, while noble boots must splash away." Umbrellas were depicted as tools of vanity, rebellion, and even foreign corruption. Some claim their Eastern origin made them un-French. Yet the satire only fueled their popularity. Umbrellas became fashion statements, often decorated, embroidered, or carried with pride. Even fashion plates of the era, illustrations of current trends, began to include them. The umbrella was now a political object, hidden in plain sight. So we must ask, how does an object as mundane as an umbrella come to represent social defiance? And what happens when those who walk dry begin to challenge those who ride high? When we left off, umbrellas were causing an uproar in the streets of Paris. They were being torn from hands, mocked in print, and attacked by coachmen, whose monopoly on dry travel was being undermined by the growing popularity of this portable canopy. But the umbrella did more than shield rain. It revealed the cracks in Parisian society, between the working poor and the newly confident middle class, between tradition and modernity, and between control and convenience. And in a city already simmering with inequality, something small became something enormous. By the early 1780s, umbrella harassment had become so common that groups of pedestrians began walking together for protection, carrying umbrellas in clusters, much like a phalanx. These were not riots in the traditional sense, but walking protests, intentionally visible and provocative. Contemporary observers described students in matching coats walking arm in arm with open umbrellas, chanting verses mocking coachmen, women's reading clubs organizing umbrella outings where they strolled slowly past carriage stations, law clerks and tradesmen gathering at cafes to compare umbrella damages. Some even began carrying iron-tipped umbrellas for defense. This was the birth of what some historians cheekily call the Dry Rebellion, small, symbolic, and performed in everyday acts, but full of quiet fury. The tipping point came in 1786, when a public brawl between a coachman and a young clerk turned violent near the Pont Neuf. The coachman reportedly tried to run his carriage through a group of umbrella-carrying pedestrians. One man struck the carriage with his umbrella handle. The coachman retaliated with his whip. A crowd gathered. Umbrellas were raised like batons. Stones were thrown. Horses reared. Several people were injured. One fell into the river. This event, dubbed La Bataille de Parapluies, the Battle of the Umbrellas, sparked citywide unrest over the next few days. Coachmen attacked several umbrella users in retaliation. Umbrella shops reported surging sales and smashed windows. City authorities began to patrol certain streets, warning umbrella provocateurs to disperse. The umbrella had gone from accessory to ideology. The carriage guilds, seeing their economic influence threatened, demanded formal restrictions on umbrella use. They petitioned the Parisian Municipal Council to ban umbrellas from being open on major thoroughfares, impose a canopy tax on non-noble users of personal rain protection, require guild-approved insignia on umbrellas sold within city limits. The council rejected most of these, unwilling to escalate tensions further. But they did issue a curious compromise. Umbrella users were asked to lower their canopies when approaching a carriage station to avoid provoking the working classes. This made things worse. Satirical publications quickly pounced. One headline read, "The nobility may ride, The poor may walk, but the middle must bow. It was a moment of clarity for many in Paris. The umbrella, small and silent, had revealed the absurdity of the social order, though the umbrella riots faded by the late 1780s. Overshadowed by greater tensions, the object itself had become a loaded symbol. Artists and pamphleteers began using umbrellas as metaphors for bourgeois independence, protection from tyranny, the absurd fragility of aristocratic pride. In several early revolutionary cartoons, the king is shown holding an umbrella labeled privilege, while commoners huddle beneath one marked patriotism. Umbrellas appeared in mock coats of arms, on playing cards, and even in jewelry worn by reformist women, where a miniature parasol might dangle next to a liberty cap. The very object once seen as effeminate, foreign, or laughable had become a badge of pride. By 1789, as revolution loomed, the Paris umbrella trade was thriving. Artisans had developed cheaper, collapsible models for urban use. Merchants advertised umbrellas suitable for the citizen stroll. Some cafes even offered shared umbrellas for patrons, a sort of early rental model. The guilds lost their grip. Coachmen could no longer intimidate. And in a poetic turn, some coach drivers began carrying umbrellas themselves, not for passengers, but for their own use. The umbrella had crossed class lines completely. It was no longer a threat. It was a norm. In later decades, the story of the umbrella riots was largely forgotten, but the pattern it revealed repeats throughout history. The bicycle, once mocked as a poor man's horse, was ridiculed and resisted. The wristwatch, seen as effeminate in the early 20th century, was rejected by traditionalists. The smartphone in its earliest iterations was treated as unnecessary, vain, even antisocial. In each case, a personal technology challenged existing systems of mobility, time, or information. And in each case, the opposition wasn't really about the object. It was about who was allowed to use it and what that usage represented. So the next time you open an umbrella in the rain, consider this. You are reenacting a quiet revolution, one where the right to stay dry became a matter of dignity, defiance, and design.